May subtitle dyan. For privacy. Yeah, this is on me. Okay, so I just thought for our last final lecture this semester, before I force you guys to, I don't know, hindi naman force you, I mean, before you guys submit to me your masterpieces, no? Magnum opus soon. Let's have a discussion about this. No, I mean, seriously speaking, as far as this class is concerned, all classes obviously are special, right? It's just that some classes are special in their own way, you know, to put it in a Tolstoy way. Now this is important because as we were discussing a while ago, the Philippines is in a very tricky situation. But I think that trickiness also is a kind of a call to really proper deep thinking, you know, including on our foreign policy. I think one of our biggest problem is we generally treat foreign policy as an elite issue that should not be a concern of the masses or the people. But the problem is that the elite have failed us because, as I mentioned earlier, things that are like mainstream points of discussion, like the concept of sharp power, you barely hear it among our elites. As I mentioned also earlier, like often people ask me from abroad, like who's the kind of version of Kissinger in the Philippines, right? And like I scratch my head and oh no. And then, this is not a praise to him. It's like just the idea, who are your elder statesmen, big thinkers in the Philippines, right? And this is a concern. And obviously I got to think more about it when I realized Kissinger is asking also for my ideas about the region, etc. So I feel one of the biggest problems we have in our country is what I would say is lack of a dialectical thinking, right? Our inability to think beyond false binaries. And I think that has been constantly a problem, especially as we enter what many believe is literally becoming a new Cold War between two superpowers. So as we think the region becomes more bipolar, it just reinforces that lack of dialectical thinking and that kind of false binary thinking. So that's why commonly people say, oh, this is the pro-US stance, this is the pro-China stance. Or you hear words about the lesser evil, right? When in fact, when it comes to matters of foreign policy, why should we even choose an evil, lesser or greater? Isn't there a better option? No? But how can you pursue better options when you cannot think beyond lesser evil or binary oppositions or false binaries? I think if I got this from Slavoj Žižek or something like that, like someone went to a restaurant and asked like if they want to get a coffee, and then someone said like the options were, do you like a coffee or a coffee? Do you want a coffee with milk, right? The usual one, or you want a coffee without the milk, right? So it didn't say like, so parang the negation or the absence was a property of the coffee. Do you get what I'm saying? Like that's dialectical thinking, right? It's not just brewed coffee or brewed coffee with coffee mate, no? The coffee that doesn't have the milk in itself, the absence is a property. Do you get what I'm saying? So dialectical thinking is like that, right? So you just don't look at things at the first instance, you look at also what's not there, because the absence also shapes the presence. Do you get what I'm saying? So, and I think that philosophical training always helped me to better appreciate complexity and fluidity in international relations. So, the other way of looking at the importance of dialectical thinking is this. So the term we use in international relations, especially in constructivism, as we discussed earlier, is mutual constitutiveness. How does it work? So usually when we discuss international relations, it's about how do we deal with US or how do we deal with China? As if those two superpowers already have, you know, a playbook, and it's just a matter of adjusting to that playbook. Well, the reality is that actually, if you apply game theory, everyone is trying to preempt everyone else. Now, obviously, we're not the same, but when America approaches the Philippines, the way they approach us and treat us also depends on how we allow them to treat us and how we treat them accordingly, right? There's a mutual constitutiveness to that. In fact, the other term that is being used also is relationality, right? So China's foreign policy in the region is based on its understanding of its place in the region. But how does it determine what is placed in the region? It determines it based on how it's treated by others. So this is the mirror effect in sociology, right? Remember we talked about that. So you have to have an endogenous theory, right, of understanding how powers understand their own place in the world and accordingly how they treat other country. And that tells you also about how much influence we have in terms of how these countries treat us. Now, again, this has roots in Hegel and dialectical thinking. So Hegel would argue, so he would say the point of analysis starts with the master and the slave. The master's conception of himself as a master depends on the recognition of the master by the slave. So even in a highly asymmetrical relationship between the master and slave, the slave has a power over the master, because the master's recognition of himself as a master of the slave depends on the slave's recognition of that fact, right? And much of history is when that recognition element is no longer smooth, when the slave challenges that, right? You can go biblical about this, right? When the Jews, Moses and his people tried to challenge, their condition in Egypt. You can also be, Marxist about this, and you can say once the proletariat challenged their structural oppression, that's where, and they go against the bourgeois class, that's where you can have a communist revolution, so on and so forth. So there are many ways of looking at this issue of mutual constitutiveness. In German, I think the term is Sittlichkeit, which is like embeddedness, right? So each of us, we treat each other based on our understanding of our place within a specific context, right? The same thing also applies in international relations. So again, that's a dialectical thinking. So if you just say, oh, ito yung offer ng US, ito yung offer ng China, and we should respond accordingly. Well, the problem with that is you're not appreciating how much influence you may have also on how they look at themselves in this part of the world, right? And believe it or not, sometimes when the two superpowers are getting more competitive with each other, they're more open to get inputs from others, because that's very relevant to their own competition with each other, right? Hey, see, I can win ASEAN more to my side. No, I win ASEAN side more to my. So that gives us a leverage. Do you understand what's going on here? Or in a very utilitarian sense, look at how the BRI has forced America and the West to come up with alternative initiatives. Now, all of them, you can say, are scammy in one way or another. Like, where's the BRI investment here? But I can also ask, where are the American investment here, right? Where's the Blue Dot Network? Where's the, build back, build a better world? Like all of these different initiatives that the West came up. Where's the BUILD initiative, the acronym BUILD that the Trump administration was proposing, was supposed to be $60 billion. But you see, the fact that they're forced to come up with all of these initiatives means that there's a dialectical process there. And they care also about how we respond to their initiatives, because that also changes their calculus. So it's a relational, it's a mutual constitutive kind of thinking. Now that should tell you about perhaps the paradigm that should shape our understanding where the Philippines is. Now, obviously in the previous lectures, we talk about the concept of hedging. This might sound very transactional, but it kind of makes sense, no? It kind of makes sense, especially when we're looking at our region where no one wants to make a choice. The choice is not to make a choice between the two superpowers, because all of us want to make the most out of our individual relationship with these two superpowers. The US is still by far the most dominant naval power, military power in our part of the world. China is developing a symmetrical capability against that, but it's conventionally US is still a superpower for now. But at the same time, US doesn't have the kind of trade relationship and gravitas and trajectory that China has. China is now the top trading partner of everyone in ASEAN, right? And it's by far, the numbers don't even compare, right? I think the numbers in the Philippines, maybe the spread, pag sinabi mo yung Hong Kong, could be between 6-1 or 7-1, right? It's a huge difference. It's even more and more pronounced in some of the other countries. So when you talk about hedging, as we discussed, it's an instinctive and at the same time conscious commitment to, quote, offset risks by pursuing multiple policy options that are intended to produce mutually counteracting effects under a situation of high uncertainty and high stakes. In short, you want to remain non-committal, and you at the same time don't want to burn the bridges with any of the superpowers, right? So that explains why one day you're saying we want a golden era of relationship with China. Literally, that's what we say, the Chinese, when we have presidents like Duterte and Marcos. The next day you go to the US and say, oh, we share common challenges in the region and we have to deal with them. And like, who else is that but China, right? When you talk about the bigger region, when you talk about Taiwan, right? So that sounds very much like mutually counteracting. That sounds very much like, contradictory policy positioning. But that makes sense from a rational standpoint when you're under a situation of high uncertainty, right? High uncertainty because we really don't know what's really China's intention. Do they want to really be the new hegemon? Do they want to just be the big boy in the town? Do they want to just So for instance, just look at the China's 9-dash line. We don't know what that is. Is it claiming the entire South China Sea, all islands, all the waters, all resources? Or is it just some islands, their surrounding waters and the resources? Or some islands and then some resource sharing there? You get what I'm saying? Like, just the Chinese 9-dash line in the South China Sea can be interpreted in 3 different ways. So it's very hard to decipher what is China's intention. And some would argue even China doesn't know what it actually wants. It's just, trial balloons, testing the waters, checking how far it can go, right? Which is kind of my reading of it. I don't think China has still a grand strategy with precise details, right? It's grand in terms of grand vagueness, but I think in terms of details, it's still up for negotiation. And high stakes. The problem is that if we make a mistake, let's say, tatay tayo sa America, let's fully align with them, and then for some reason they get 3 Trumps in a row, or something more Trump than Trump, which is, if you look at the roster of Republican, I mean, two of the 5 candidates there are more Trump than Trump, right? So, are we sure, with more America first president in the future, can we rely on them to stand by us if things go crazy there, right? Let's say in Taiwan, or let's say in the West Philippine Sea, we're not very sure about that, right? How stable is American political system? But also with China, you cannot also be too naive and assume the best about them. What if they're actually having aggressive intentions? Maybe you should also think of hope for the best but prepare for the worst, right? So all of those elements are absolutely present when it comes to Philippines and many ASEAN's relations with the 2 superpowers. So it's an insurance-seeking strategic behavior, no, which insists on not overtly or irreversibly taking sides between the contending powers. I added overtly and irreversibly because overtly means you officialize that. You make it in your statements. We are with America against China or something like that. Like in the ways like Ukraine, we're with NATO against Russia, right? That's overt, but that's already in a situation where there's no uncertainty. Russia has already invaded you. There's no uncertainty about that, right? And irreversible, meaning maybe today I sound a little bit closer to American position, but I can change that in a year or so. So case in point, I always talk about Singapore. If you look at the Singaporean statements in 2021, early Biden administration, it seemed to be much more hewing to America's vision for the region. Since last year, especially this year, we see Singapore is more and more critical. And sometimes you tend to see Singapore as almost blaming US for how the relationships is going sour with China. Case in point, on the issue of sanctions against Chinese semiconductors. So if you look at the rhetoric of Singapore, it's almost they're saying, it's not like China is blameless, but you're definitely escalating the situation with all of these crazy sanctions on their semiconductor industry. And guess what? China is the important component of a regional supply chain. So if you hit China, if you hit all of us, because we Singaporeans are heavily invested in them, it's a hedging. So now they're more critical of US, but it's not like they're gonna jump to the Chinese side. And this is the situation that most of us want to keep ourselves. You can also look at Malaysia, for instance. Look at the situation with Malaysia until Najib's end, the Najib administration, Najib, one MDB guy, right? Malaysia was very, let's say, soft on the South China Sea issue. Then comes Mahathir. Then compare the first 6 months of Mahathir with the last 6 months of Mahathir 2.0. Totally different positions than China on the debt trap issue and the South China Sea issue. And then now you have an interesting situation. Anwar Ibrahim is their prime minister who was from opposition, supposed to be more critical of China. He's being criticized by the Najib people as not being tough enough on China. Interesting, right? And I can go on and on. Vietnam is another interesting case that we also discussed as far as multi-alignment is concerned. So now Vietnam realized, I'm not sure I can count on US or Philippines to keep China in check. Guess what? I'm also going to reach out to them. Now, of course, the complicating factor for Vietnam is that their top defense partner, Russia, is kind of out of the picture now because you cannot buy anything from Russia without incurring huge sanctions. So now they have to scramble, keep things on an even keel with China while reaching out to India, reaching out to South Korea, Japan, and EU to kind of fill in for whatever they cannot get from Russia anymore. It's a very difficult process. That's why when Blinken goes there to talk about comprehensive strategic partnership, that's why when Kamala Harris goes there, literally the Vietnamese say, oh, that doesn't mean we're siding with you against China. And have you noticed since last year, the Vietnamese keep on emphasizing party-to-party dialogue, emphasizing, color revolutions. We have to stand together. And you saw how annoyed Vietnam was when they were not invited to the Global Democracy Summit and they had to explain what is a socialist democracy. So you see kind of an ideological turn in Vietnam's foreign policy language. It doesn't mean ideology is everything, because we know these countries are still national interest wise. But you could see that by emphasizing ideology and party-to-party relations, it makes it easier for them to soften the blow as far as their tensions with China is concerned. Do you get what I'm saying? So this is where ideology can be transactionally helpful. Although I'm not questioning the sincerity of the Vietnamese leadership's belief in the values of socialism for the 21st century. But you get what I'm saying here. So these are all forms of hedging. I call it 50 shades of hedging, right? Very different versions of hedging. And we see in cases like in the Philippines, you literally have hedging not only from one administration to the other, you have hedging within the administration. So everyone talks about how Marcos' policy is so different from Duterte. I said, that's wrong. Marcos' policy is very different from early Duterte, because if you look at Duterte 2021 and 2022, it was already back to normal. VFA was restored. In fact, in 2021, in the China-ASEAN meeting, Duterte even criticized China. How do I know this? Because as a journalist, I have to write about every major event every other week, unlike other academics who just, no. So things were already very different towards the end of Duterte. So when we talk about Duterte era and like how different it was, you're really talking about 2016, 17, 18 essentially. I think that ended really after the visit of Xi Jinping in November 2018, because they realized this is not what both sides were thinking about. This is not going to be, us against the world kind of drama that Duterte was talking about in 2016. Now, some would say that hedging is a kind of a third strategic choice, or it's kind of a middle position or golden mean. But the thing is, hedging only works to a certain degree. So Ukraine cannot hedge anymore because there's already a war there and they need NATO help, right? So it works short of situation of all-out war, right? So there are caveats. It doesn't work all the time. I always say there could come a time when we have to make our choices. And there are people in the Philippines who want the Philippines to already make a choice between US and China, believing that US is the threat. And you also have people who are saying US is passé, it's time to embrace the new big boy in town. So we already see efforts in that regard, but clearly as far as hedging is concerned, it might not work, because sometimes hedging could be just an instinct of the president or people in the foreign policy elite, but it's not really well thought out. When I say well thought out, meaning you have certain indicators that will make you say it's time to choose, right? That are short of actual invasion or war, right? So like in the case of Ukraine, the situation was clear. Russia invades, total war, enemy. But we know in the 21st century, countries can hurt each other in different ways. Trade sanctions, cyber warfare, all sorts of different, sharp power, we already talked about that. Those could be ways whereby you could get hurt by another country or without, seeing the overtness of a direct invasion. Is that a ground for alignment or not? See, if you have a coherent foreign policy, you have a clear definitions. Pag ito yung mga na-cross na lines, boom, that's it. We're gonna side with country X versus country Y. I'm not sure we're clear about that. Like as far as our relations with China is concerned, I'm not really clear. It's not clear to me what are the red lines aside from the obvious red lines. Like wag mong sugurin yung mga islands natin dyan sa Pag-asa. Like that's kind of obvious. But let's say cyber warfare. Let's say, all other things that could hurt the Philippine economy or even more. Would that constitute a basis for us to make a choice already and end the hedging? It's a very serious discussion. It's a very difficult conversation. It's becoming more and more difficult also with advances in technology, right? With advent of artificial intelligence, 5G network, new technologies bring new capabilities. They also bring new ways to hurt each other, right? And of course, superpowers are always at the cutting edge of this thing. So there are certain structural preconditions, for hedging to work. So you cannot hedge forever, right? At some point, you'll have to make a choice. So hedging in a way is a luxury. It's a luxury that countries can afford in a situation of, let's say, mid-intensity Cold War, right? So one way of looking at it is this: US and China were never going to be really friends, right? Because of factors that we can say. So there are essentially three phases we have to look at. Strategic competition, which is essentially peaceful coexistence. Like, I'm not a fan of you, you're not a fan of me, but each to his own. Let's just call it G2, right? I think we're already past that, especially since Trump era. I think we're now in second phase, which is, you can better call it a strategic rivalry, right? Whereby like, I don't like you, you don't like me, and there's certain parts where I have to punch you a bit, you have to punch me back. It's just gonna be like that. But we're not still phase 3, which is strategic confrontation, which is what we had during the old Cold War, where literally Soviet Union was trying to put nuclear missiles in Cuba that would put much of US within its radar. You get what I'm saying? So we're not there yet, but clearly we're at least at the mid phase of strategic competition between the two superpowers, strategic rivalry actually, right? So maybe pwede pang hedging. But once we go to the next phase, right? So I can think about a Taiwan war. I think once the Taiwan war happens, God forbid, and magkakaalaman na because the two superpowers will try to pull strings. The news for the Philippines is that I think China will already assume we're on the American side once the Taiwan war happens. So our bases are already going to be a target regardless. So neutrality is not sure an option for the Philippines. But if you're Singapore or Thailand, or more importantly, if you're someone like Vietnam or Malaysia and Indonesia, I think you still have room for maneuver. But most likely, Americans will be really pissed off if you don't help them, and that is going to have long-term implications, right? So fence-sitters will suddenly find the fence has moved and then they fell down on one side, right? I'm just pushing the metaphor for us to realize the ground can shift, right? And I think a Taiwan war could be one of them. So these are the things we're looking at. But I would add to this theoretical discourse, but I would say that hedging is also applicable when you have third options. And as Japan becomes more of its own force, that's my contention. Of course, you can argue with that. As India definitely becomes its own force, I'm much more confident in that contention. And as EU tries to become its own force, Macron, strategic autonomy, I roll, but actually behind the scenes, everyone agrees with him in Europe, especially those who don't want to get involved with Taiwan and China war because they already have too much Russia under the table. Then we're talking about something interesting here, right? So I think many of us in ASEAN, we want EU, Japan, other powers to become more and more autonomous power, maximally autonomous power, because that allows us to hedge. We can choose not to side with any of those two by being on the other side. My term for that is coalition of the unwilling, right? We have to create a coalition of the unwilling of countries who may be closer to US, but are going to say, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to go that far to totally provoke China, right? Or you could be even closer to China and yet open to reaching out to the US. So let's just call it the coalition of the unwilling. You may be more to one side than the other, but you still don't want to be defined by the preferences or recklessness of any of the two superpowers. Now, none of this is to say that US and China are morally equal. I mean, just in the case of the Philippines, we know who's bullying us in the West Philippine Sea. It's not the US. It's not the US which is threatening Taiwan, right? We know who's threatening. So this is not about drawing moral equivalence. But we saw during the Trump years and the Bush years how US could become also a problem for us. They forced us into the Iraq war, created a mess. Look at the Trump, the way he was handling alliances and trade relations. That's not what we want to deal with. So I think it's also important to talk about a third pole of coalition of the unwilling, right? It could be close US partners like Europeans, like France, which doesn't want to be a addendum of America, or it could be a big giant like India, which is we're with you on issue X, Y, and Z, but not to all the way, 100%. And they made it absolutely clear during the Ukraine war when the Indians refused to side with the West on the Russia questions, because guess what? We also get our best weapon systems from Russia so far because you didn't want to share that with us. And we still want to get weapon systems from them like S-400, etc. What? You're going to sanction us? Let's see what's that going to do, right? So if you look at it, the Quad is not as, let's say, chummy, right, alliance of democracies anymore. It's looking a bit different. And you also see here and there are more and more criticisms of Modi administration. There are times where Biden kind of implies that I'm not sure about how democratic is India considering what's happening there, right? But anyway, so that's why in a different lecture I discussed about multi-alignment, right? How multi-alignment, actually non-alignment is kind of not option anymore. It's more like a multi-alignment strategy that is being employed by different countries. And that brought us to the issue of the Philippines. And we talk about the dilemmas that Marcos Jr. was facing. We talk about the EDCA issue. But my contention is that when you look at the EDCA issue, I don't think this is the end of hedging. Because have you noticed, before the EDCA site announcement, during the EDCA site announcement, after the EDCA site announcement, you constantly hear Marcos Jr. saying they will not be used for offensive military operations. Now, we can have a debate about the operational details, but clearly, as far as Marcos and what he understands, he doesn't want to be dragged into this. He doesn't want the Philippines to be an extension of American industrial military complex. Now, you don't have to be a fan of Marcos to kind of say, maybe he's genuine, because I don't think Marcos Jr. really wants to be involved in the war, and I don't think Marcos Jr. wants to burn bridges with China. Because literally, they want the Chinese to build some of the bridges here in the Philippines. Because Marcos knows very well that Biden, or whoever is the next American president, is not in a position to give us what we need. America doesn't have BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese have not still given us the real BRI. They gave us pledge trap, not even debt trap. But they still have the money. We know that. If they really want to give us, they can give us. And they can give us at good rates too. So, case in point, the Bandung-Jakarta high-speed railway. There was a strategic decision by Xi Jinping to make that a 1% interest rate project. Usually, the Chinese projects are 3%, 3.5%, etc., which is like market rates. And then sometimes they could put provisions which may have national security or national sorry. But they can adjust that, right? So we're still waiting for China to offer us real funding for Clark Manila high-speed railway. Or, I mean, go to Laos. Laos now has a better train system than 90% of ASEAN. So the poorest, or second to the poorest country, has like bullet train a la Tokyo, right? I mean, it's insane, right? Now, of course, you can name many accidents that happen in China, but you're missing the point. China is the leading country right now in terms of development of high-speed railway. China is one of the leading countries in 5G network. Now, it doesn't mean everything Chinese is good, but in the same way, it doesn't mean everything Chinese is bad. They can actually give us also high-tech technology, and they're already the leaders in EV, for instance, electric vehicles. So, if you're Marcos, you don't want to burn bridges with China because you know the US cannot give you everything you need. And as I said, I mentioned, the Philippines' relationship with US is lopsided at a low equilibrium, right? So it's more military than economic. So I'll explain you why. The Philippines' total trade, the Philippines' exports to US is like 1/10 of just Vietnam's trade surplus with the US, right? So Vietnam has more than 100 billion of just trade surplus with the US. The Philippines' FDI stock from US is 1 to 100 based on what measure you look. So it was like 5 to 6 billion the other year. In Singapore, by some estimate, it's 500 billion. Now, of course, you can say Singapore is actually an entrepot, so some of the investments that go to Singapore gets recycled around. But still, 1 to 100 or 1 to 60 or even 1 to 40 is the most generous comparison I can make. And the Philippines, the only US treaty ally and the only former colony. That's kind of crazy. Now, but it's lopsided at a low equilibrium. Why? The Philippine foreign military financing is just what? $100 million? Ukraine got $42 billion last year alone. Okay, let's say Ukraine is a special case. They're European, they could be Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt got billions of dollars, right? In terms of military aid, including F-16 fighters, Abrams tanks fighters. What did the Philippines get all of these years? Now, I know I'm sounding Duterte, and that's what was he reading my articles? But that doesn't mean that, but the idea is that doesn't mean the alliance is bad or useless. That just means you're not juicing it properly. Some people are sleeping on their job. That's what I'm saying here, right? Because given the growing importance of the Philippines, right? Huge importance of the Philippines, especially with all these bases, the leverage is actually with the Philippines. Have you noticed? Biden was supposedly the first one to call Marcos. Biden is super nice and charming to Marcos. How many American top cabinet members visit? You think they came here because they're fan of Marcos? No, they came here because Philippines is important. That's why I don't buy this argument na salamat kay Tatay Digong, siniseryoso na tayo in America. No, whoever is in the Philippines nowadays, or even 6 years ago, you will be treated very well just because we're important to them, because of the China question, and now because of the Taiwan question. It's a structural advantage and leverage point, right? So my contention is the Philippines is more to the right, if right means more US conservative power, left is alternative power. We're much more to the right of practically all ASEAN countries, but we have still not crossed the line into alignment. I don't think we want to cross the line to alignment. And for me, the Philippine bases that are very close to Taiwan is actually in Mavulis and a bit in Fuga. And I don't know if those could be open to Americans in an event of contingency or short of that. And by the way, some of these bases being open to US are sites. Mali pa yung map na yan. Are sites. Ano ibig sabihin yan? Wala lang. Parang bakal gym. Yung mga bakal gym lang. Like, there's nothing there. And the US has allocated, what, $180 million? You cannot even build a mega mall with that. Forget about building like, Subic Bay facility style. So, actually, I think the problem is that a lot of people are exaggerating the importance of some of these sites, which are not even full-fledged bases, which kind of fuels this kind of a Cold War, new Cold War drama and all. So if you're Marcos, you should actually say, these are just sites. You go to the Cagayan, the two sites that are being offered, wala, parang lang fishing community lang ganun. So it's not like we're opening up, camp this or camp that. We're not, this is not Cold War period, panahon ni Marcos Sr. And now they had permanent bases here and all. So I think that's the problem sometimes. Both pro-US elements and pro-China elements exaggerate the importance. So they help us to not appreciate where Marcos is coming from. Because if you're Marcos, you're gonna say, marami naman dyan, ano lang yan, bakal gym lang yan. Di pa kami nag-align. So kung kausap mo yung China, wala lang yan, bakal gym lang yan. Pwede kong palitan, lagay ko lang sa kabila yan, di ba? And remember, I always said, EDCA is very flexible, inherently flexible. And our exercises, the number of exercises, the nature of exercises are flexible, including the location. Your balikatan could be in Zambales, it could be in Cagayan, or it could be all the way somewhere else, right? Totally nothing to do with West Philippines in China. We can negotiate that on a yearly basis. We can have 300, we can have 500 joint exercises. So pwede mo i-dribble yan. Again, Philippines is way to the right of most ASEAN countries in terms of siding with the conservative status quo power. But the argument that the Philippines is like a deputy sheriff of US in ASEAN, that's ridiculous. That's not the situation. But I'm hearing versions of that from even some of our ASEAN friends. Like literally taxi drivers in Kuala Lumpur would say, oh, Philippines already choose its side, right? I almost made the imitation. I realized maybe it's not right. We'll make it somewhere else. And then not to mention, of course, pushback internally, Imelda Marcos. Aimee, Maria Imelda, Aimee, Marcos Jr., among others, Duterte, etc. Let's see with the vice president. Some are saying this is already having domestic political implications with the whole Arroyo Romualdez drama. Some are saying there's clearly a China-US element to that because, it seems there's factions there in the Congress who are very critical of where Marcos is heading, and they want to kind of challenge that by taking over the leadership of the lower house because we know Romualdez is solid with the president and their cousins, etc. Okay, now which brings us really to the discussion about the Philippines. So, as we mentioned in a previous meeting, I said, are we hedging or aligning? So our contention is we're still hedging. It's a much more, let's say, soft hedging compared to hard hedging. Soft in the sense that it's almost going towards alignment, but it's still hedging for me. That's my contention. But can we do multi-alignment like India or Vietnam? We explained that in previous, it's a structurally different case because they don't have a treaty alliance, right? And in the case of Philippines, right, we don't also have minimum deterrence capability as Vietnam or India. And India's situation is more border warfare that is very different from the maritime disputes we're having. Vietnam has both, right, border problem and maritime, but they have a more or less formidable minimum deterrence capability which you don't have, right, including Russian weaponry, kilo-class submarines, etc. Is hedging even possible under conditions of a new Cold War? That's open for debate. As I said, what are the indicators for us to say it's an end of it? So we can be very systematic about it. And then I discuss about Philippine exceptionalism, right? We do things differently, right? Our rhetoric, our mindsets, our approach is very different. That's why for me, it's really a big mystery why many Americans took the Philippines for granted for a long time. Actually, it's not a mystery. We know the answer, but it's an anomaly. I think that's better. It's an anomaly. It's so anomalous how pathetically small our trade and investment relations is with someone who's supposed to be our sole treaty ally. It's just pathetic, the numbers. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people are so proud. Okay, great, we have call center investment, etc. But maybe you want to have more semiconductors. 90% of high-end semiconductor production is in just Taiwan, just there, which, by the way, is the capital of Taiwan is much closer to us than most ASEAN major capitals, right? forget about the high-end ones. Even if the medium-end ones are brought to the Philippines, I mean, we already have Texas Instrument in the Philippines, right? I mean, you can imagine there could be a Taiwan Plus strategy in the Philippines could be a big beneficiary of that. Is there a movement in that front? I don't know. But my point is, I don't buy the argument that the Philippines doesn't have what it takes to do semiconductors, because we already are big producers and exporters of intermediate semiconductors. I think moving up should not be a problem. Now, why do I argue that there should be a unique approach to understanding Philippines foreign policy in the 21st century? Because I think we inherited a lot of nonsense from 20th century experience. And let's be honest, during the 20th century, we're more like a pawn than an agent. But the 21st century is proving very interesting, very complicated, but also full of opportunity. So let's just go through a number of myths that I feel we should get rid of, or we should at least deconstruct, to better understand where the Philippines should go. First of all, this is the most annoying one. The Philippines is a small power. That it's such a common thing that even yours truly used that idea. I mean, I use the term tragedy of small power politics. But for me, it was more for aesthetic purposes, because I like tragedy of middle power, like it's ugly, right? Because a tragedy of great power politics was the one by Mersheimer, right? So you make it tragedy of small power, and the next thing I know, other people are copying exactly the same title. But anyways, that's not an issue. But honestly, are we a small power? I mean, seriously. I mean, first of all, even if you look at the crudest estimates, like the global firepower, we're almost at top 30, right? This is the crudest. I am no fan of the global firepower. I think it's a joke, right? But the Philippines actually ranks, I think, higher than Mexico and North Korea. We outrank North Korea in terms of military capability, according to very crude, raw ones, right? Philippines could be already top 30 in the world in nominal GDP. It's already top 30 in PPP, purchasing power parity. Again, this is out of how many countries are out there? Depending on indices, between 150 to 200 countries or more. So that easily puts you in what? Beyond the 70th percentile. You're easily in the top 25, 30% of the world. How does that make you small? I don't understand, right? Population. We're number 13 now. I can easily see Russia going down. I mean, come on. You think, Japan, not much is happening, right? So short of those countries importing, huge immigrant, those countries are going to go down the rankings. Ethiopia is going to be a bit tough, but I think the Philippines can overtake them soon. I think our population is already bigger than Ethiopia by some estimates. So you can imagine Philippines will be top 10, more or less tied with Mexico. I think it's a good competitive fight with Mexicanos, right? I think we can catch up with Mexicanos very soon, right? So that will make the Philippines top 10 most populous countries on earth. How can you tell me anyone who calls Mexico a small country, right? So it's ridiculous to call us a small country. And he said, no, but the size of the archipelago. But Japan is also very small, but we say they're big because of the size of their population, among other things, right? So these are the things. These are things, these are impressions. Now, I know the psychology behind that. The psychology is this David versus Goliath, Diskarte yan, grit, like all that kind of stuff we get from, your usual telenovelas out there, right? But the reality is we're not the kawawa guy fighting against the bully mayaman. We're more like the average employee guy who actually has a chance to move up the ranks. So like if this were a telenovela, I think we're way past the whatever script they're feeding us there. I'm not gonna say more because I got bashed a lot for my statements on Philippine cinema. So I'll just keep it there. Alright? But my idea is telenovela pa lang, it feeds into that myth. So our strategic myths are affected by our mass culture myths, right? And they're totally divorced from the reality, the material realities we're facing. By some estimates, we're already the fourth largest economy in ASEAN, and we can be easily the second biggest just after Indonesia. I think kayang Singapore, even Thailand, kaya. Maybe Vietnam will be hard, but definitely Indonesia, no chance. So second or third is very doable. And to call us small, I mean, like, that's ridiculous, right? The second thing, I always hear this in the Philippines. I always hear this, like, oh, we have a great geography. We're so blessed with it. It's like, yeah, except it's double-edged sword, right? It works different ways. Now, before I go into the military side, let's go to the economic side. So, actually, economically speaking, our geography is not that good. So if you look at the Philippines' position in the regional supply chains, again, very peripheral. Because If you are in continental Southeast Asia, especially like Thailand, you're connected to Malaysia and Singapore, not too far from Indonesia. Guess what? You're also close to Vietnam, which is connected to China, right? And then look at the Philippines, quite far away from the rest. So when you look at logistics, supply chains, Philippines is actually quite peripheral, and all the numbers are clear. Look at our share of exports, and that it's a proxy for production. Look at a lot of indices there that look at the productive capacities of countries in the region. But the one in the middle, sorry, it's a little bit blurred because I'm yet to find the original one. But that looks at the countries that are most benefiting from China plus one strategy. So you see Vietnam, Thailand, Belgium, Sweden, and India there. Philippines, you cannot find it there. That's really anomalous because the Philippines is supposed to have one of the cheapest labor. If you look at the other indices, very competitive with Vietnam and not Thailand, but Vietnam, right? So clearly, our geography, I don't think has been as helpful, for instance, to our integration into regional supply chains, right? But more importantly, actually, our geography is proving to be a problem for us militarily. Because if you look at the island chain strategy of China, the first island chain running from Ryukyu, East China Sea down to the South China Sea and all, andyan ang Pilipinas. You look at the second island chain, practically Philippine Sea going all the way down to the South Pacific, kasama tayo. We're essentially sandwiched, or more to one side than like a patagilid na sandwich, as far as the two island chain strategy of China is concerned. The idea of the Chinese is that they have to dominate the first island chain before the end of this decade, and hopefully by the middle of this century, they have to dominate the second island chain. Once they do that, they can control completely Taiwan and force the rest of the region into different forms of tributary relationship, because that essentially means US out. So US will be on the outer perimeter in Guam or Hawaii. Of course, you cannot kick them out of there. That's total nuclear war. But anything short of that, you can keep them out. And you can keep them out in many ways. Conventionally, asymmetrically. Asymmetrically, they're already getting close to the first island chain domination, right? Now, this is so influential in shaping China's foreign policy that for a while we had commentators like Hugh White in Australia arguing that let's just accept it, the first island chain, it's just a matter of time. So let's focus on the second island chain. Thankfully, those people are now irrelevant as far as shaping politics. But I remember 6-7 years, that was the big one. There was a lot of discussion, tanggapin natin yan. Parang this is the Caribbean to the Chinese. Like the same way now you don't expect, I don't know, England to dominate the Caribbean. It's America's backyard. In the same way, this is kind of that, right? Except, of course, I'll say there's Cuba, right? Which is not on America's side, but maybe we can be the Cuba, right? Like the only last one with, an American flag there, standing up to America. Right? That's a good one. They're like, we will be the Cuba of the Asian Caribbean, the only last island refusing to bow to the Chinese hegemony, right? We can do that. Essentially, everyone else. Well, a lot of our good neighbors wouldn't have much problem because they're Confucian values. Like all the richest industrial countries are all scenic cultures, right? Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, right? Of course, I'm not going to say that on the record, but the adjustment will not be too difficult. Tayo is like, I don't want to learn the language. Come on, we'll just stick with America, right? Anyways, Guam, I think 60% are Filipino anyway. Right? We can recreate the East Indies, Spanish, mini empire. But you get it. I can imagine us being the Cuba of that Caribbean. Diba? So here you see the geography is actually not working for the Philippines. It's actually a big challenge, a serious challenge. And why is this important? Because going back to this, look at some of the sites that you want to develop. Have you noticed they also have an orientation towards the Philippine Sea and Benham Rise? Why is that important? Because we're totally blind on this issue. We don't know what's going on there because whatever limited asset we have, it's on the other side, West Philippine Sea, and then down towards Sulu Sea, etc. Because so there's a counterterrorism issue here, there's a West Philippine Sea issue here. So practically, voila. So the hope of the AFP is by more American presence and capacity building assistance, we'll have something to do about the second island chain. And as far as China is concerned, they're not 100% successful in level 1, but they're already active in level 2. So it's not sequential. It's a simultaneous strategy. But it's like, you're like Pac-Man, you're operating on 2 games at the same time. You're already 80% here, you're just 20% here. Guess what? We cannot even see the 20% the Chinese are doing here. So we had reports a few years ago that China is supposedly naming sub-sea features there in the Benham Rise without us So the second myth is our geography is good, we're taken care of. Just relax, chill, everything's there. We're small, but we're okay. Our geography is perfect. Guess what? We're not small, nor is our geography okay. Actually, it's extremely challenging. Find me another country that ipit between the two. You can say Indonesia, but they're way down there. But there's a reason why they call it North Natuna Sea, because they fear that it will be mahakot ng China doon sa kanyang strategy. So they have to rename the area a la Philippines, West Philippine Sea. The West Philippine Sea is our exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. So West Philippine Sea has a Venn diagram overlap, but it's not the entirety of South China Sea. So yung mga iba dyan, don't call it South China. No, then we're not claiming the entire South China. Are we China? We're not. We're just claiming our exclusive economic zone of the West Philippine Sea. The Indonesians are doing the same dun sa baba, sa waters off the Natuna Islands. The third myth is this. This is not an endorsement, but the question is, do we really have to choose between the two? My sense is, I think this cartoon by Stephen Case, actually used in one of my articles on South China Morning Post, actually is an interesting thought experiment. And who knows, maybe this is what BBM is thinking. I can have a little bit of American cake, also a little bit of the Chinese cake. It's just a question of, proportions, right? And how much I can, juice out from both sides. Speaking of this, and this is where we're going to get a little bit more theoretical and serious. So for a very long time, let's say the dominant discourse was this. Are we moving from an era of hyperpower, meaning America's full spectrum dominance, to a kind of a bipolar order? No. So Francis Fukuyama obviously was very influential in kind of being the guy behind the idea that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's over, right? It's over. Panalo na tayo. Everyone will try to just mimic us, right? And whoever wants to challenge us, who takes their ideology seriously? The problem is, actually, the Chinese are openly talking about the Chinese model of development, which is having a lot of soft power influence. Maybe not in the Philippines, but if you go to Latin America, where they have a lot of issues with America, you go to Africa, China is very popular. You go to the Middle East, China is very popular. What do you think Saudi Arabia and Iran? We're okay with China brokering it, but not US or anyone else. Only China. Because they don't see China as a threat. They see China as a very useful friend and partner. They don't have territorial disputes with them, right? And many are attracted to the Chinese model because it's very easy to replicate. Authoritarian, aggressive capitalist expansion. It's like, we can do that. Rule of law, EU, regulation, woke, we can't do that. That's too complicated. The Chinese model is more instinctive to a lot of authoritarian and post-colonial leaders because most post-colonial leaders are not democratic. How many full-fledged democracies do we have in the post-colonial world? The oldest democracies in post-colonial world are what? Philippines, Sri Lanka, in Asia for instance. Philippines, India, Sri Lanka. Guess what? Kamusta ang kalagayan ng demokrasya natin? One is under Modi, one is, I don't know, whatever came after Rajapaksa, but Rajapaksa's could come back. I heard a Sri Lankan said, remember the Rajapaksa brothers kicked out of Sri Lanka because of the debt issue? Said, well, Philippines elected again another Marcos. Who knows about that? I literally heard on BBC an MP in Sri Lanka citing the Philippine example to say, you never know. Maybe they come back not after 40 years, 4 years. That's their deadline, right? So that's how we are a role model for a lot of our friends across the Indo-Pacific. Wow, I needed a reminder of how much of a role model we are, right? Jeez. Okay, now, just as the Fukuyaman argument got questioned, including by Fukuyama himself, right? Because his argument is, no, you caricatured my argument. There was also a Nietzsche there where I talk about the last man. You only look at the end of history, but then in fairness, my point is the last man, so meron siyang palusot. But the other very important argument that two very influential people have been essentially making, one is Brzezinski, who was the former national security advisor of Carter, right? Carter, right? Was it Carter or was it Reagan? And then the other one is Henry Kissinger, right? Essentially the argument is world order is about managing the appetite and aspiration of essentially big boys. And the big boys are essentially US and China, sorry to the rest, right? But that narrative is also now under question. Is it really about just two superpowers? Now, let me push it a little bit more. My argument is one of the biggest intellectual problems we have is we're criticizing Eurocentric. In the process, we're falling for sinocentric understanding of the world. So look at a lot of people who criticize mainstream social science or media coverage as Western, American, Eurocentric. And then immediately they fall into the Chinese sinocentric trap. For instance, these are some of the interesting books that could put things into perspective. For instance, if you look at the Peter Frankopan argument in the Silk Roads, is that first of all, it was not a singular road. Like the Chinese propaganda is this, everything started in China, in Xi'an, and then we benevolently just gave all of these barbarians a piece of our civilization. That's the Chinese line. Well, the reality was more like, there was so much already going on in the Middle East. They had the Persian Empire, the Royal Road, there was the Romans, and then at some point when the Chinese defeated the Turkic people in today's Xinjiang, then they suddenly entered the world that was already there. So the Gansu corridor, and then they went to Xinjiang, Kashgar, and then from there. So it's not like Chinese invented it. It was already there. They just got connected at some point when the Han pushed out Turkic people into today's Xinjiang. Xinjiang literally means the new frontier. And they're not Han Chinese, you know what I'm saying? And that's why anyway, so the problem is we always criticize the West and then we immediately fall into Chinese. In fact, some would argue that even the idea of the tributary system, that there was, before the arrival of the West, there was a Chinese tributary system. Like that's essentially an invention of a Harvard professor at Fairbairn, right? That's actually a Western scholar interpretation of what happened. There's a reason why we call the Chinese Sangli, right? Sangli comes from, the etymology is from the Chinese word that says merchant. So when the quote-unquote Chinese were here 500 years ago, when you ask them, where are you from? They'll just say, we're merchants. Many would argue whether there was even a conception of China as China. So we have scholars who argue that the modern nation state of China is an invention of modernity. Back in the day, you were from Fujian. You were from Guangdong. You know what I'm saying? Like, the idea of a kind of, like a concrete nation that did not exist. Remember, China for hundreds of years was under non-Han empires. Yuan were Mongols, right? The Qing, the last dynasty, were Manchus. You know what I'm saying? Like, so the idea that of this Chinese nation states, so many scholars would actually begin to argue, and you will see more of that in, for instance, the Ayse Zarakol's book, Before the West. Her contention, so she's a Turkish scholar based in Cambridge University. She's very interesting. Her argument is that a lot of things we attribute to either China or big empires, they're actually products of the Mongol Empire. So the Mongol Empire, remember, is the only empire that almost conquered the entire Eurasian, or at least the Asian. Like they went all the way, remember, there were like 4 houses at some point. 1 China, 1 Central Asia, 1 Persia, Il Khanate, and the Golden Horde. And all of these regions, if you look at it, look at all the enemies of the West today. All the 3 major powers aligning with them. All of them were part of the... And look at it. China, Russia, all of them have similar authoritarian world view, universal. And her argument would be a lot of that is what they inherited from the Mongols. In fact, her argument is that the early Ming emperors and dynasties, a lot of their conception of mandate of heaven, guess what? The Mongols had that already, right? A lot of things we attribute to either Russia civilization or Chinese civilization, they actually have a root in the Mongol Empire. And in fact, her argument is that the more modern versions of globalization really happened under the Mongols because they're the only ones who fully controlled multiple corners of Asia and connected them through the descendants of Genghis Khan, etc., although it was competitive. So the argument is that there was already a world order and an international relations before the arrival of European colonization in this part of the world. Because if you look at the mainstream IR, which we discuss a lot, it's all about European history and just extrapolating and applying. Parang ganito, the normal West, like the normal Eurocentric is this. We were just a bunch of guys doing our own business, and then these guys came, colonized all of us, and then connected us. So like we were just, but the argument here is no, we were already fully integrated, globalized models. And for instance, she looks at 3 major empires in West Asia and South Asia, which are very similar political systems and essentially even language. So the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, and Ottoman Empire, all of them had Islamic, Persia, Turkic, and Mongolian elements to them in terms of their leadership, in terms of the systems of government, and that covers a huge part of the world. And they had an international relations among each other, right? So there are many scholars who are questioning both the sinocentric, which is the alternative, and at the same time the Eurocentric. that actually there's other ways of looking at it, right? There's a new journal article by I said that looks at the role of slavery in shaping modern international relations. None of the things we discussed in any of the readings I gave you. Remember how many readings I gave you? None of these things are being discussed there in any serious work. So this is what you can call post-Western international relations. By actually literally looking at the other international relations. We were relating to each other in Asia, right? Before the advent of European colonization. You literally have evidence of materials from Java and Southeast Asia found in Rome that went through Bengal or went to, I don't know, parts of India, etc. They were very, very robust trade and economic relations. Now, the other book I want to also mention is the book Empire of the Winds. This is very important because we always hear this argument from our friends in China that like, oh, you know, Admiral Zhang He, who by the way was not even Chinese, he was from Central Asia, and from Persian background. The argument is that our ancestors went around and, you know, the South China Sea, etc., blah, 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 all of that. But what they forget is to mention that the Bajaus and indigenous people here, the Majapahit and Srivijaya and the empire, there were empires here in Southeast Asia which had constant naval presence in the area and trade. And Malay was a language of trade, right? And it was very much connected into the broader monsoon trade that was happening all the way to Yemen, all the way to the Persian Gulf, even all the way to East Coast Africa. So these are the things that we tend to not appreciate, that we had actually empires, very maritime, globalized empires in our part of the world prior to the arrival of Western empires. So in short, we're seeing more and more studies that show that neither the tributary sinocentric is correct, nor is the Eurocentric correct. That what we need is actually a pluricentric understanding of the international system, because there were multiple powers. It was a very multipolar system back in the day, right? Now, which brings me to the last part of our discussion. If you look at the Philippines, it's already considered as a middle power, in fact, even ahead of others, because being middle power is not just about your GDP size, your military size, your geography. It's also about your behavior. What kind of behavior? Are you a constructive player in the international system? Because you may have nuclear weapons like North Korea, but clearly you're not making a lot of friends, right? And you're not contributing to an international humanitarian regime. You're not helping with peacekeeping efforts. Now, if you look at the Philippines, interestingly, even if we had many problematic presidents, if you look at our votes in the United Nations, if you look at our contribution to the international humanitarian law, if you look at our role during the formative years of United Nations, if you look at our voting record on Ukraine, for instance, from Duterte to Marcos, we were consistently among the more quote-unquote constructive players. We played a very important role in coalition building, different coalitions that we discussed that in our class that push for the developing countries' voice in WTO negotiations. So if you look at many dimensions of our interventions, including our arbitration award, which is now being invoked by the Vietnamese, by the Malaysians, by Indonesians, even by Taiwanese when it serves their purpose, right? Because, for instance, the Scarborough Shoal is seen as a common fishing ground. So Taiwanese and Vietnamese will justify their presence there for them. So those are huge contribution to the international order, modern international law-based international order. Do you get what I'm saying? So if you look at middle powers as countries that have a minimum degree of strategic autonomy because they're not totally dependent on another superpower to feed themselves, right? Like, no offense to Cambodia, but some would say at some point like 1/3 of their budget, national budget, maybe an 8 from... We don't have that situation. No major power has more than few single-digit contribution to our national budget, right? We're more or less, we have fiscal autonomy to a certain degree. Yeah, we need, but like we don't need America to bail us out. It doesn't work that way, right? We're not some forsaken fourth world country, right? So if you look at that, the Philippines actually is even ranked ahead of some other more powerful countries like Egypt, like Turkey, like United Arab Emirates, because it's a question of contribution to the international order. It's about coalition building. It's also about brand. Actually, ang bango ng Pilipinas pagdating sa international UN fora. We tend to be very dominant. Our embassy in the UN tends to be very, very influential and dominant and highly respected, even during the Duterte era, right? So measurements of middle power look at your behavior, your contribution, your ability to build coalitions, your credibility. So credibility, coalition building, and basic capacity. Those three C's are very important, right? As I always discuss, those are the elements that are very important. Now, why is this? Why? Because being middle is also 50 shades, right? Like you can be middle all the way to Japan, India, but also you can be middle as humble as, I don't know. Think of something, like let's look at the countries here in the list. Sri Lanka, I mean, no offense, or something like that, right? Right? So, no, I mean, they're great people. I'm just saying in terms of size of their economy, they're much smaller than us. I think their GDP is like, what, 50 billion, 40, 60 billion? Like, it's not much, right? Or their population is quite small, Sri Lanka. And yet they could also be considered middle power because of the positive contributions they made. Whether to regional integration in South Asia, whether to developing countries. So they're also considered, or post-war Iraq for that matter, which has had to deal with a lot of problems. Now, if you look at it, the landscape is very competitive, right? So yes, it's true. US and China are the number 1 and number 2. But pag sinama mo pag tinignan mo yung Lowy Institute, right? Samahan mo yung rankings ng number 3 and 4, already lalampas na yung China. So if you combine the powers of India and Japan, you can already imagine it yourself. Just put the numbers of India and Japan together, it's already bigger than China's. And why is this important? You can say, well, Japan is a shrinking power. It's like, well, actually, Japan has not punched yet. Like, we haven't seen anything of Japan because they still have a pacifist constitution, right? If those guys, third largest economy, go all the way in and really translate that into military power, it's going to be a Gundam, what I'm saying? They're going to make robots and all of that. They're going to take over. What I'm saying? Never underestimate the job. Voltes 5 level na yan. All right? Like all respect to China for AI and all, but I'm telling you, once Voltes 5 comes in, it's over, right? And India, don't underestimate those guys, right? They have a lot to offer. India is not there yet, right? They're now the biggest population, but they're still a lower middle income country. They're not, but once they hit it, they're going to be something big, right? And as more Apple products, as more products that used to be China is being shifted to India, as India adopts more industrial policy, don't underestimate India. Over the past 10 years, they have built so many railways, they have built so many airports, etc. Like, unfortunately, we had some incidents recently. But India is also a country fast on the move. Now, I know that people will watch Slumdog Millionaire and make judgments about India and all, but the reality is that country is finally on the move. There's a reason why India doesn't want to join any trade agreements nowadays, because they want to first strengthen their manufacturing base. Once they're ready to export, then they're going to join. Yeah, we want to join, because at that point, they can export. It's exactly where Japan and all found us. So only fools, you can guess which countries, na open up when we're not ready. Next thing you know, wala na yung Marikina industry, right? So the Indians are smart. They realize you don't open up unless you're ready to not only compete, but dominate, right? And they have the scale, right? So just look at that. Now, let's say Japan goes down a bit, but the potential of India, because they're starting from a low base, is huge. They can keep on growing for 5-6% for quite some time. There's Australia, there's Korea, there's Indonesia, which is another country that is not also there. It's like Indonesia is like another India, right? They have the size and all of that, but they're still not at their acceleration point, takeoff point. So if you put even few of these countries together, they easily already surpass the overall power index of China in the Lowy Institute Index, which I think is the closest we can get to a quantitative understanding of power. Way better than the global firepower, blah, blah, blah. Yung mga crude ones. Right? If you have a better index, come ahead. So my point is, I can...
Index na po yan. Ano po yung source?
That's Lowy Institute. That's the Lowy Institute. I got it from the Channel News Asia. It's... Yeah, I don't know where's the other slide. There's another slide that actually has the quantitative numbers now more accurate. But you can already see, just visualize it, put 3 and 4 together is already higher than 2. Right? And guess what? 3, 4, 6, and all, they're all like quad already. It's like, even if it's just US, Australia, Japan and Korea, like that's already huge, right? And clearly Indonesia is not, is not excited about Chinese hegemony or Pax Sinica. Now, in fact, what makes this even more interesting is that a lot of assumptions we made about it's just a matter of time before China becomes number 1 is suddenly like, I'm not sure about that. Especially when it became so look at there was a special essay by the economists that look at different indicators in terms of productivity, in terms of inflation, in terms of fertility rate. If you put a lot of them, Actually, more and more people are arguing that it's very possible, as the Bloomberg title put it, when will China be the world's biggest economy? Maybe never, right? So so it used to be like 2030, that's it, it's over. It used to be even earlier, 20 something, 2020, and then it didn't happen. Some are saying it might happen in 2040, but because of shrinking population, US will come back again stronger because the US population keeps on growing. You know why, of course, right? So multiple studies are suggesting that it's either very unlikely that China will take over, but if they're gonna take over, it's gonna be way into this century, or they temporarily take over in 2040, but because of shrinking population, they're gonna come back. So suddenly, all of these projections are being questioned. The earlier projections about China. At the same time, if you look at practically all projections about India and Indonesia, they're all bullish, just because they're really starting from a low base, right? When Chinese per capita income is more than $10,000. India is barely $3,000. So you can see how much room for improvement there is. Indonesia is $4,000. So they can grow at 8-10% even if they get certain things right. Now, we can have a long debate about alternative models of development, but my sense is both Indonesia and India are also pushing harder for manufacturing industrial policy. Like, for instance, Jokowi is forcing more companies to process their minerals inside Indonesia. He's pushing for Tesla to do more EV batteries there. Why? Because they realize that you cannot just use services. But look at it, these two countries are growing so fast, even if they don't have a real manufacturing sector yet. So imagine if they build that manufacturing sector and what AI could bring in terms of new avenues of growth and all. We're almost done. So what am I telling you guys? What I'm telling you guys is it's a very fluid picture. It's not just like US and China. There's so much going on there. Like, this is an interesting, fascinating picture. And this is not what we're getting in mainstream discussion. In mainstream discussion is, pumili ka na. Diba? Like, tataya ka na ngayon bago na tayo ng China. Or, nasa US pa rin tayo. Malakas kasing US eh. Ganun. You're missing the point. There's so much more going on. So, that's why I always go eye roll when I hear some friends, especially from Singapore, who always say, oh yeah, when two elephants make love, when the two elephants fight, like, yeah, but they're like zebras and lions, and you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a zoo. It's not just two elephants in the grass. You think India is grass? No. They're a huge thing themselves. You think Japan is? Come on, So that's my problem. Bad metaphors. Lousy metaphors is creating a lot of fatalism, a lot of wrong prognostication. So, yes, the Philippines, tricky geography. Yes, we have not been punching at our weight class, forget about. But there's so much more going on there. And that is why my contention is maybe multi-alignment and hedging is quite feasible for the foreseeable future. Because we can get we cannot get 10 from any bilateral relationship. Everyone has their limitations. But if I get 2 from Korea, 3 from Japan, 2 from Australia, 1 from ASEAN in general, 3 from India at some point. You know what I'm saying? You put all of that together, it creates some room for maneuver, room for leverage. Again, the conventional understanding is this. Saan tayo tataya? As if it's a game of 10 or 0. When it's a game of getting the most and gathering the most numbers and putting it together. Do you get what I'm saying? The permutations just give you an idea of how fluid the strategic landscape is. So in this strategic landscape, it's a betrayal of our national interest and intellectual, right, interest, right, to see the world through the prism of just 2 big powers. It is not just 2 elephants making love and fighting. It's a zoo, and in that zoo, we can make many interesting alliances. It's just like, I don't know, Big Brother house you can make. It's more like Squid Game, right? We can make many alliances. And look at Squid Game. Who expected those finalists will be the finalists? Because they were smart in alliance building. They were not, did you watch, forget about Squid Game, did you watch Physical 100, right? I totally did not expect those will be the finalists, right? Physical 100, that like parang Squid Game but real life. Like, some call it Royd's 100, but I don't want to get there. You know what I'm saying? Like, I found that very fascinating because for me, that's international relations. That's how it works. Actually, the biggest Olympic gold guys don't win. Most of them get eliminated. It's the guy who are just next, they actually win. Or let me use Succession. It's the Toms who win. You know what I'm saying? It's not it's not Kendalls who win. It's not Rommel. That's what I'm saying. We can be the Tom of international relations. The guys are underestimated, but they know how to network. They know how to make the most out of situation. This is not a call for a moral internationalization. We have to have a principled position on many things, but that should not deprive us from also defending our national interests and making the most out of this very, very fluid situation. All right? On that note, thank you very much. I think we went over time, way over time, but thank you for sticking around. Are there any questions? Anyone? Or comments or suggestions, etc.? I just realized I can go on for like 3 hours just explaining different sides of this, right? Anyone? I mean, literally every paragraph you see there, there's like 5 articles behind it, right? Or something like that, you know? So this is just a teaser. Anyone? I really like that. But for me, like there could be a cake there of an India cake, a little bit smaller slice, there's the Korean cake. You can complete your, you know, it doesn't have to be either of those two guys, right? There's so much more room, right? Parang sarap ng buhay pag presidente kayo ng Pilipinas. Like ang swerte ni Marcos Jr. He became the president at the best time. I mean, so the term is strategic sweet spot. We are literally in a strategic sweet spot. Like literally we can get sweets from here and there. But we have to be able to use it. But how can we use it if we fall for nonsensical, you know, 20th century myths and all of that? Once we get rid of those myths, we realize like, wow, we can be a player actually here. Not big, but big enough, right? We don't lack size. Actually, we have enough size, enough people, enough economic size, enough, hopefully soon, military heft. And you know what I'm saying? And why should we fall for either Eurocentric and sino-centric? Let's go for a different, complete understanding and paradigm of international system, right? An Asian studies, which is not China studies. No offense to our China studies friends, right? Yeah. Or not a new Cold War, which is like you have two main protagonists, but actually they're just there to make the rest more interesting. Have you noticed like a lot of Oscars supporting actor goes to peripheral actors who actually steal the show? I think the first time we saw that was with Game of Thrones, right? A lot of non-Jon Snows were getting very popular, right? And actually we're more like a Game of Thrones plot, whereby it's not very clear there's really one central or two central. Have you noticed that's the beauty of the Fire and Ice, like all of the series, right? There's or House of Dragon, like there's no really one or two central characters. Like 20 characters, 2 or 3 have a little bit more prominence, but it's more like this graph. It's like, yes, a little bit more than the rest, but actually the rest are catching up, and you put them together, they actually have more role than number 1 or 2. It's not like our telenovelas, which is like, here 100 and the 1% na dami mga sidekicks. Hindi eh. My backstory, my villain story. So actually, international relations nowadays is like a nice plot. It's like a nice plot whereby you have many characters with backstories, complex characters, many different sides to them, right? So when Indonesia says we need to have our own conception of an Indo-Pacific, which is not defined by the West, it doesn't mean we want to be pro-China. It's just saying, let's have a conception whereby China is there and US or the West is not determining what that order should be. We should have a say in that. We're not so successful so far, but if we up our game, we have a better understanding, we get more lectures like this, probably, then we'll be in better place. But just look at it. Prior to many of our discussions, those myths tend to always shape our understanding of Philippine foreign policy. As a small power, what should we do? We have a nice location, we can fall on that, right? Or what else? You know, like, so these are or like, no, we have to choose, tatay, the US ba tayo or China ba tayo? Mga like, I don't know. For me, it's a multi-dimensional, balancing, asymmetrical game. It's multi-dimensional because on some issues, we have more overlap with China than US, and on some issues, we have more overlap with with China or US. But of course, some issues are more important than others. So for maybe West Philippine Sea is more important than some other issues, right? But it's multi-dimensional. It's asymmetric because one is a treaty ally, one is not, right? Just by that. And it's fluid because things could change, right? So this is how we should understand. For me, that should be a template for Philippine foreign policy in the 21st century. All right? Okay, that seems like a podcast. Whew. Any other question? Yes.
What can the Philippines do to be able to take it seriously as a middle power, and how can we use it to conduct our foreign policy?
Yeah. I mean, I as a Filipino, like, you know, when I give lectures around the world, I'm feeling the respect. I never felt being taken for granted because I realized once you make your argument strong and you're confident of this, you can win the room, right? And my sense is when our diplomats do that, they get a lot of respect. I see in United Nations our diplomats get a lot of respect, etc. And now with the Duterte drama a little bit, you know, as we move on, I think we're in a situation to be taken more and more seriously. I think it's a combination of making big splashes here diplomatically and then slowly backing it up with capacity building, right? So, dati pinagtatawanan tayo pag nagpapadala tayo ng warships sa mga joint exercise kasi yun yung pinakamabagal. I wanted to mention cars, right? And then na baka mabash ako, di ba? Maybe I'll close that and then I can give you examples, right? But, I don't know. I mean, let's just say we went from jeepney to Geely. You get what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying? Like, we're not BMW or, you know, but we're like Geely, right? My new favorite car, right? Or T-Cross, you know, some Volkswagen. You get what I'm saying? We're not, you know, no, I love Jeep. I'm just saying, like, we're kind of here na eh, di ba? We're not here yet, but we're here na. So, huwag na natin underestimate at umaayos at naman medyo improve na yung capacity natin. And we may have a submarine within a decade. And then we went from no fighter jets na modern to at least advanced trainer fighter jets that could put us in position to get real fourth generation fighter jets. So, being taken seriously is about making strong statements and slowly backing up with real capacity and all. One of the things I noticed, like a lot of people who came to the Philippines for the first time, they're so impressed, which just tells you how low their expectation was of the Philippines, right? Especially, of course, I tend to meet, you know, diplomats or officials, let's say in BGC, right, or Makati area. Like I always say, this is not entire to Manila, but the fact that there's such thing in Manila shocks them because they thought they're gonna come here and see favela this, favela, like kind of, you know, that's their and then siguro one nice mansion there, and then like with some haciendero, small. That's like their expectation of Manila, and then they come here, it's like whoa, like 3 Shangri-La hotels, right? It's crazy, right? And then BGC, it's like formal, Lamborghini after Lamborghini, right? Like I mean, I saw more Lamborghinis and Ferraris in Manila than in Italy, than in Milan, than in Roma, than in Venice. You know, I was just there in like Venice. There are more. I was in Ibiza, in Spain. I see more luxury here than there. That doesn't mean we're rich country. We're not. Obviously inequality, but we're no longer, you know, pichukin na. So I think as we host more and more and we show our basic infrastructure, kasi the problem with the Philippines was all of them is, paano naman kasi yung mga sumisikat na Filipino movie, anong pinapakita? Parang yung Fear Factor, yung pinapakita nila sa Fear Factor. And then they come and they say, okay, actually they have the great. You get what I'm saying? So, I think we can be easily taken seriously, not as a big player, but as a medium-sized player, if we just do some good splashes and all, and you know, put the right people as our diplomats and the face of our country, and you know, work it from there. And capacity building, okay naman yung traject. Like, so many people don't even know the Philippines already has a few warships or semi-frigates, and they don't even know that. I talked to some people who, including some people in our syllabus, right? Like, their analysis of Philippines is still 2001. Like, seriously. Like, it's still then. Like, really? You have warships? Like, really? You have inside skyscraper? Like, yeah, of course, you know. We have Skyway even. Mahal, but at least we have Skyway, you know what I'm saying? And in 3 years, we're gonna have our first, you know, underground metro stations, you know, opened here and there. So, again, we're not first world, but we're getting close to second world, if I can put it that way, right? We have a good shot at being a second world country. Second world, like, it's not the Cold War one. It's more like Argentina, Turkey, Malaysia, right? Or Thailand, I could say, is almost second world. They're not like Singapore and all fancy, but they're good, they're decent, they're fine. Actually, I personally prefer to live in a second world country than a first world country. Because you don't have to pay for the pretension, right? And yet you can, like, I love Istanbul. I love KL. KL is my favorite capital in Southeast Asia, aside from our very lovable Baguio. No, but you get what I'm saying? Because the prices are decent, not pretentious, right? And the infrastructure is decent, it's clean, it's nice and all of that. I'd rather be in those places. Istanbul also very affordable, right? Than like in the posh cities and all of that, the pretentious posh cities. I'm not gonna name names, but you can guess, right? Or cities that don't deserve to be in first world. Why are you there, right? It's like horrible subway, like horrible airports, and like how are you even in the first world? It doesn't make sense, right? You can guess which cities I'm talking about. There's so many overrated cities out there. So for me, that's the reasonable target within within a generation at least, right? That I think we can meet. Okay, for me, target second world. That should be our target. And believe me, a second world country is not bad. That means majority are middle class. Not really rich like OECD, but middle class. Essentially Korea of 10 years ago. That should be our target. You know what I'm saying? Like, middle class society, nothing too fancy, just fine. I think that's very attainable. And when you have a population twice bigger than South Korea, with the wealth level of South Korea 10 years ago, that could put you very much in the conversation. Right? Yeah. You get what I'm saying? Like, we're not thinking creatively. Hanggang self-deprecating jokes na lang tayo. I mean, I realize how pathetic our jokes are. They're all self-deprecating. And self-deprecating is not humility, it's humiliation. It's self-humiliation. I hate those jokes. Like, corny. Philippines, I'm like, dude, have you been in XYZ? I'm not gonna say it, right? Like, I've been in different countries, like, oof, you have no idea, right, what you're talking about. The rush hour is still okay, you know what I'm saying? The taxi drivers are still okay, So we always think we're the worst or we're the best to be special, right? We're not. We're just one of the semi-better doing emerging markets that has size and scale and momentum. So why not? Have you noticed I completely I'm putting aside the domestic politics. My sense is whoever is the president, even if empty yung seat of president, the structural momentum is there for us to be semi-second world country in the coming years. Yeah. Within a decade, at my suspicion, kaya natin. Because if you've been in Thailand 10, 20 years ago, and look at Bangkok right now, ang laki ng improvement. Vietnam is scary because in 5 years, they went from fourth world to second world. Wow, crazy. Like, I was in Coron, right? Like, it's like squatter and all of that there. Like, and then I was in Da Nang in Vietnam, a country with almost exactly the same per capita. It's nice, very nice, etc. Like, you could see the distribution is a big problem, but it just shows the potential for us to move in that direction. Yeah. I think I'm over-explaining. Anyone else? See, you're so impressed. We went 1 hour over time. Anyone else? Any question? None? All right, on that note, thank you very much for a great semester. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I just tried to make it different, right? Not the typical discuss readings. No. Let's push the envelope. Let's think 10 years ahead. Let's think 20 years ahead, right? Let's think differently. Let's dare to think, right? Why should we wait for some European scholar to tell us about the world or some guy in China to tell us about the non-Western world? No. Why should we wait for Indians to do post-colonial analysis? We can do it ourselves. That was always my point. Right? And every time I'm telling you, I embody that in my own life. As a journalist, as a thinker, I never allowed anyone to underestimate me because I come from some supposedly third world country, whatever. No way. So what? Nothing makes you special. Let's go. Right? Anyways, thank you very much for listening to the Haydarian paradigm of 21st century. I just happen to be from Philippines, so sinama natin dyan. I could have given a lecture in any other country, like in Latin America, we can do this, amigos, Thank you, I really appreciate it. So, when is the submission? 17. So in a week from now, no? Almost exactly a week from the next Saturday, right? So submit to me before 7 p.m. All right? Okay? So parang it's our class hours, right? So you submit to me before 7 p.m. So you give me enough time to check the papers line by line. So some of you had a sneak peek of how I check papers, like whether undergraduate layers or just the last semester. I go really line by line, right? I'm very strict, right? And okay, I already know your voice, how you write, so don't ChatGPT me, alright? It's very obvious if it's not you. ChatGPT can replicate you if you already have a huge body of work. So potentially it can do a Haydarian ChatGPT or something like that. But that's the reason why I ask you guys to submit me a lot, because it will be my yardstick to see, not same person. Have you noticed? Think about any sentence, type it on Google, you'll never find an exact sentence out there. Every human being has a unique intellectual marker. We may use the same words, but our combinations are unique to every human being. It's one of the most fascinating things we don't appreciate. Literally, think of a whole sentence, put it on Google. It's impossible you'll find exactly the same composition by anyone. Unless, of course, it's like, I am stupid or something like that. Of course, you'll find. But you like, just copy paste any paragraph or sentence from your papers, put it there, you won't find it. Unless, of course, you're plagiarizing yourself or plagiarizing, period, right? So, yeah. So, good luck. I look forward to your papers, and I hope you learned enough from this class so that this inspires you for the future, etc. I know that in an ideal world, we would have had like this every day, but my sense is, even with the with the online classes, I felt we still had enough engagement and discussion. I mean, I work in the media, so I can see if people are bored. I mean, it's our job to make sure people are engaged, right? So I'm not this guy na walang pakel, just lecture everyone sleeping. No, I constantly check everyone's like, am I connecting to that guy? Is that person appreciating what I'm saying? Because if you don't engage your students, you're not gonna learn. And what I really love about teaching graduate classes is because I'm learning from you guys. And literally, you might find later on that there are a lot of markers on your papers, but with no comments. That just means I like that part, and I treat it like a reading. Like I'm learning from your paper. Do you get what I'm saying? Usually I use color Tiffany or green or something like that, right? Like, or turquoise, like something like that. Yellow is just, so my mga, you can guess it when you see it, like the red or yellows might be problematic. But there are ones I'm just highlighting because I just find it nice. This is good. So it doesn't mean anything negative, right? So if ever you see any markers there, okay? So in the paper, there'll be general comments on the top with the grade, and then there'll be line-by-line commentaries, and the two have to correspond with each other. And as I said, in your final paper, you can use any authoritative source, not just academic source, especially when you talk about more contemporary. So none of you have an excuse to say, wala akong nahanap na reading. Practically all of you, with the exception of one or two, your topics are gas-gas, right? So I want to see how you render it better, right? You get what I'm saying? So none of you has an excuse. All of these topics have already been covered in one way or another, and there's so much reading on each of your topics. I practically have read so much on each of the topics you mentioned. You can see it when we are consulting. Familiar ako dun. Like literal, I may even have written about the topic, right? So that means they're mainstream discussions. They're not fringe topics you're taking on. So, let's not think masyadong fancy, avant-garde. No, walang avant-garde topic. Some of your topic are more speculative. So I said, go ahead, do policy recommendations. No problem. That will be your substance. Because if there's none, then you make it, right? So I want you guys to also build the confidence to make your own judgment call, analytic judgment calls. So as much as we have to so I always say to write, read. Because once you read, you realize, ang dami pang pwedeng sabihin eh. Yun pala eh, di ba? Like I when I was younger, undergraduate, you used to think all the great things have been already said in social sciences. Like how I wish I was born in the 18th century so I could be the David Hume. And I said, actually, that's just chapter 1. So much coming. Di ba? AI, all that, I can write so much. And look at this about non-sino-centric, non-eurocentric. These conversations were non-existent almost 100 years ago. Now, I think, as a Filipino scholar, I feel privileged. I think we're at the forefront of discussion, right? And salamat sa ating napakagaling na presidente at dating presidente. Tayo po ay siniseryoso ng mga malalaking bansa. Kaya people, you know what I'm saying? Right? You know what I'm saying? We're there. Alright? Thank you guys. Don't worry, I'll cut out those parts. Like, back of my head, don't worry. Lahat yan, madidelete lahat yan. Alright? I'll just put 2 minutes lang there. Alright? Alright guys, thank you very much. Let's take a picture maybe, class, or something. Yeah.